The Fed just did something nobody expected. Officials discussed raising rates, not cutting them. Hi, everybody. I'm Christos, co-founder of Caplytica. Today, we're recapping news from the last week that's reshaping how investors should think about the rest of 2026. The Fed's surprising hawkish shift, economic data that's flashing warning signs, and a Supreme Court ruling on tariffs that sparked immediate retaliation from the White House. There's one upcoming economic release that Fed Governor Waller explicitly said will determine the March rate decision, and it's not the inflation data most people are watching. I'll explain why it matters. Let's get into it. Rate cuts were supposed to be the story of 2026. Markets had priced in multiple cuts, analysts were debating timing, and investors positioned themselves accordingly. Then, the January Fed minutes dropped last week, and the narrative fell apart. Several Fed officials discussed the possibility of raising rates if inflation doesn't moderate. Not just holding steady, but actively hiking. This represents a complete reversal from the expectations that dominated late 2025. The internal disagreement is what makes this particularly significant. Fed Governor Waller emphasized that the February jobs report will be the deciding factor for March. Chicago Fed President Goolsbee offered a more optimistic view, suggesting that several rate cuts remain possible if inflation gets back on track toward that 2% mark. These are not small differences in emphasis. They represent fundamentally different readings of where the economy is headed. Markets had previously priced in roughly 50% odds of a June rate cut, but that probability looks increasingly disconnected from what the Fed is actually signaling. If rates stay higher for longer, it will put pressure on growth stocks, particularly in the tech sector. The Fed's internal division also signals uncertainty ahead, which typically translates into elevated volatility across asset classes. The confusion inside the Fed becomes a lot more understandable when you look at the economic data that landed later in the week. Fourth quarter GDP came in at just 1.4%, badly missing that 2.5% estimate. Simultaneously, core PCE inflation held steady at 3%, which is exactly double the Fed's target. Slow growth and sticky inflation appearing together is the combination economists fear most. This is stagflation Lite. Not a full-blown crisis, but enough to complicate every investment decision. This is precisely why Waller pointed to the jobs report as the critical variable rather than the next inflation reading. With inflation stuck at 3% and growth already slowing, the Fed is caught between competing mandates. A strong jobs report in early March could enable them to keep fighting inflation with elevated rates. A weak one, however, could make things that much more complicated. This single data point could determine whether we see a cut, a hold, or a rate hike that's suddenly on the table. What makes this environment tricky is that traditional portfolio defenses don't work as well. When growth slows, you would normally expect the Fed to cut rates. But when growth slows and inflation stays elevated, rate cuts risk making the problem worse. The Fed has to choose. And right now, inflation concerns are winning. And it doesn't seem like the Fed can catch a break, because just as markets are processing this, the Supreme Court threw another variable into the equation. On February 20th, the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump exceeded his authority with his sweeping reciprocal tariffs. The ruling potentially put the government on the hook for up to $175 billion in refunds. Within 24 hours, Trump responded by hiking the global baseline tariff from 10% to 15%, and promising new tariffs under different legal authority. Don't expect lower prices at the store. Despite the ruling, companies that already absorbed costs aren't going to immediately reverse price increases, especially when the new tariffs are already being implemented under alternative frameworks. The new structure created an unusual situation where some US allies like the UK and EU faced higher rates, while competitors like China actually saw some modest relief. Congress now has less than 150 days to codify tariff policies into law, or face a massive revenue cliff that could force budget cuts or tax increases. For companies with international supply chains, this creates unpredictable cost structures that make planning nearly impossible. The legal battle isn't over either. This policy uncertainty adds another layer on top of that economic uncertainty we're already navigating. And markets tend to punish uncertainty with volatility, even when the underlying fundamentals haven't changed. What brings all of this together is the same story we've been hearing for the last few weeks. Conflicting signals keep popping up, preventing investors from catching their breath. The Fed is split, growth is slowing while inflation holds, and tariff policy is being decided in real time by courts and executive orders. What matters for your portfolio is not getting the next 3 months perfectly right. It's understanding how much volatility you can handle. That kind of clarity starts with knowing your risk tolerance. If you haven't thought through where you fall in that spectrum, we made a video that walks you through exactly how to assess your personal risk profile and why it matters more than most investors realize.